to shut down this room, so we should probably start. So thanks to Leslie and to David and everyone at Printed Matter for having us today, and I'm very grateful to be here with Nick. I mean, Nick and I have known each other for 16 years, 15 years, and we've been occasional collaborators, temporary colleagues, mostly friends, discussion partners. So we've had an ongoing conversation. Most of it takes the form of like self-deprecating banter, which we'll try not to replicate tonight. But we're here on the occasion of the publication of both of our new books, which in some ways is a coincidence that we're talking together because the books are coming out at the same time. But the more we started looking at each other's work and thinking about it, we really started to find some really interesting, I think, conversations between what we're doing. Between two books that feel like, I think, very much on the surface, feel quite different. So we're both going to do maybe about a 10-minute introduction to our work, just to sort of have you get your bearings, and then we'll engage in a discussion with each other, and then hopefully all of you will ask questions as well. So thanks. Okay, well, this is weird. Actually, I don't need that. Okay, so my book, and this is the cover of it, and there's a copy over here. This is a book that is really the distillation of about 12 years of work, primarily photographs, but it also includes creative writing. And they're pictures that I made across multiple continents. The anchor points for these pictures are ongoing protests in America, the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong, the war in Ukraine, but there's also includes many pictures from the Egyptian Revolution, North Korea, Cuba, and other places around the world where history has been unfolding. So for me, this book completes a trilogy of books that started with a book I did in 2013 called General Assembly, which was a kind of catalog, a sort of like typological portraiture of participants in the Occupy movement in New York. And the second book was a book called Fire in Cairo, which was an immersion into the Egyptian Revolution. But this book is quite different because whereas those books were really rooted in singular contexts, this one really weaves together multiple situations. So I'm thinking about it as a kind of oblique record of life on a faltering planet that traces the contours of our current era that are really shaped by confrontations with authoritarianism. So the book does chart a kind of escalatory pattern across collective assembly, revolutionary upheaval, totalitarian control, surveillance repression, and outright war. And I think of these as each being a different register of the same fundamental struggle. So in each of these contexts, I set out to photograph political realities, and particularly what happens when governments come into conflict with their citizens. And on some level, I think I was attempting to reckon with the role of American foreign policy plays in these dynamics. For me, it usually began with an obsession, like this impulsive sense that I need to engage with these things, with these contexts and these sort of unfolding history. And that was fueled by a mixture of, let's say, anger and curiosity and hope. And I just had this palpable sense that there were limits to what I could understand without being present. So for me, the necessary starting point was to show up, and I try to do so with a sense of openness and humility. I'm not an expert in geopolitics or organized dissent, although I do participate in many demonstrations. And I don't have a really strong sense of the images I want to make when I'm often arriving in these situations. I like to say that I try to find the ideas in my encounters and not supply them. So I don't work with assistants or fixers or drivers. I don't seek special access or embedded arrangements. I sometimes work with volunteer groups that help me get oriented, but mostly I spend a lot of my time just wandering and trying to get a sense of the rhythm of the places that I'm in. And that affords me a lot of time and space to make mistakes and just calibrate myself to these ruptures in the status quo that are unfolding around me. So this book, which it took me probably start to finish over a year to edit, it really emerged out of the ashes of 4 other books that I was working on simultaneously, and each one of those books was rooted in a specific context. There was one I was working on about Ukraine, one about the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong, one about demonstrations in America, and one of all the pictures I made when I was in North Korea. But I had the sense that those books just weren't working. The results were just too flat and predictable, and I started to think that there was something more interesting for me in the vantage point that I had across all these places and situations. So, the book shows images from Cairo and Brooklyn, Pyongyang, Hong Kong, Kyiv, Kharkiv, and they arrive without captions, and they resist sort of organization into those categories. But I do think that the political forces that the book depicts, they're not geographically bounded. I think of them as being systemic and interconnected. So editing the book was a kind of task in itself. I was really overwhelmed by all the material I had, and I spent a lot of time in a big room just trying to figure this out. And I might not have even attempted this if it wasn't without the help and encouragement of people like Nick and my publisher Bruno. And Nick actually supplied a very early edit, which was a really great foil for me to work against. And I had some notions of structure from the outset, but the more I tried to force the pictures into this preconceived structure, the more lifeless the book felt to me. So I felt ultimately, and I think this is really related to the conversation that some of you, I think, just heard with Leslie, I really just had to feel my way towards structure, I would start with ideas, but then I had to abandon them, and I just went through a continual process of that. Yeah. So what else can I say? So Joan Didion has this quote that has always been important to me. And she says, I write entirely to find out what I'm thinking, what I'm looking at, what I see, and what it means. And I think I sort of try to channel that ethos in the way that I go about into the world and photograph. I photograph to find out what I'm thinking, But my goal has never been for these pictures to be a chronicle necessarily, or a form of explanation to others. And the book reinforces this. It removes any kind of documentary scaffolding. It has no captions or essays. And instead, all the writing it includes is fiction that I wrote that comes in a few different forms. And one of them is a table of contents, which is less of let's say, an organizing principle than a kind of poem that acts in consonance with the sequence. So it doesn't, it kind of proposes like an emotional and conceptual arc to the work rather than mechanically locking the pictures to the different chapter titles. So, and then near the end of the book, there's a short story that I wrote that is written in the first person plural, and it tries to speak from inside the condition of the photographs, a kind of collective hallucination and the texture of experience, and this is the story here. And another way of saying everything I've been saying is that I like to say I was not speaking about, but I was speaking nearby. So I began editing this book in the fall of 2024, and I think that was against the backdrop of the US presidential elections, and that was really weighing on me and impacting my state of mind. And I think ultimately it influenced the tone of the edit, which is a bit darker than it might have been otherwise. Oh wait, I missed a page. So the tone is darker than it would have been otherwise, but at the same time, I think there's room for hope in this. This book encapsulates, if you include editing, over 15 years of work, and I changed a lot, and the world changed a lot in that entire time. And I've ridden so many different waves of idealism and disillusionment, hope and frustration. And the book is an attempt to contain all those things. But I do think, as I said before, I'd like to think it ends on a hopeful note with those pictures of lasers, which is this kind of coda, which are images of the Hong Kong protesters shining their laser lights on the facade of the Legislative Council building in Hong Kong. And I saw those pictures, that act, this sort of spontaneous act of collective creativity as being a kind of counterpoint to something like Albert Speer's Cathedral of Light, which is a more sort of a different kind of architecture of light that's more imposing and authorial. So that's all I have.
Hi, I'm Nicholas. So as Matt said, we see really strong connections between these two books, which is why this is a really nice opportunity to talk about them together. And there's a nice maybe happenstance, maybe just moment in which we live that these books enter the world at the same time. My book begins with diagnosing a kind of crisis that I see in the image world in which we live and make. And then moves on to kind of like a journey to try and look back into history, into ideas, and to move through my own image making to arrive at something that might be a rescue or a rehabilitation or another way forward. So what I'm going to do right now is read from the beginning of the book, which is all the crisis part. And my books always begin as lectures that then turn into books that sort of then come back out as a different form of lecture. So some of the images are not in the book, and many images in the book are not in this. It'll be about 10 minutes of reading. And then I'll read just one little moment from later in the book, because as Matthew said, I have to try to think towards hope, and that's where the book tries to go. Even though I don't have an answer for that hope. Okay. Karl Marx analyzed the systems of capital at work all around him with unparalleled exactitude and insight. But when he set to describing communism and how to get there, he had to close his eyes. He had to imagine that utopia, and he got it mostly wrong. But that blind act of hope, that closing of the eyes to see, that part was true. The following does not offer any answers. It only asks you to look around, and then to close your eyes and tell us what you see. One day, a couple years ago, the title of this talk appeared in my thoughts uninvited, like a balloon floating upwards from some demonic birthday party in my dark unconscious, a spectral gift. The moment I saw it in my mind's eye, those words typeset in a bold font, I knew it was the title of my unwritten work. I also knew that I did not know what it meant. This is my attempt to answer the two questions provoked by my uninvited title. Why is this a time of allegory? And then, what does allegory have to do with love? But first, I would like to back up to another day, a couple years before. I was leaning on a rickety wood railing, looking out over an indistinct stretch of northeast Los Angeles, talking on the phone to an old friend, a photographer whose work I admire. As my eyes absently scanned the bright, hazy horizon, her disembodied voice spoke to me as if answering a question I had not asked. I'm thinking of doing a mic drop on photography. She sent the phrase into my ear with such breezy lightness that it sounded delightful. I visualized the arm elegantly outstretched, the pause, the drop, the thud, the heel turn, the walking away, a disdainful diva move. I burst into cathartic laughter. I wanted that too, and I wanted it to be that easy. To make a photograph that carried meaning, by which I mean new insight and new feeling, had come to seem impossibly hard, exhausting. And over the past several years, I have had innumerable conversations with photographers who have expressed some version of the mic drop sentiment, the desire to be freed from the prison of image making. What had happened to photography and photographers to make this so? I say photographers, but what I mean is everyone. I only begin with photographers because with our outsized investment in the power of the image, we are the proverbial canaries in the coal mine of image extraction. It is dirty work. In a letter to a friend from around the same time, I wrote, adding more pictures to the world feels like making thin plastic bags that I know will end up in the ocean. But I have built my life around bag making, so what else am I supposed to do? I no longer want or use these bags, but it's all I know how to make. When I think of the image world we currently inhabit, I see that sea of plastic bags swirling in a vast and listless spiral in the middle of nowhere, polluting the ecosystem everywhere. Each one, like a photograph, an infinitely thin film, created to hold something of value that now holds nothing at all. But the plastic bag is just a loose and untidy metaphor, easily stretched to breaking. So let me be more specific. There is a culprit, after all. I have no choice but to conclude that realism is nothing more than a term for refusing meaning. Contemporary realism is a call for representation as only and exactly that. It is pervasive, demanding, empty, and exhausting. It is profoundly dishonest, and we are drowning in it. Realism, as it emerged in 19th century France, Russia, and England, created a poetics that emerged as if from reality, a literary and visual practice of presenting, quote, real lives, by which was often meant, by comfortable bourgeois liberals, the lives of the working, the poor, and the subjugated. It was never a pure spigot of unaltered reality. It was an aesthetic practice built on idealistic principles as well as colonialist and industrialist capitalist imperatives. Like the social sciences that emerged at the same period, it was both an activist position and a discourse that helped keep class, race, and power differentials in place. But at least this realism developed vocabularies of symbolic meaning that were collectively readable. It created shared myths of the real, which helped to maintain a morally ambivalent social consensus and advance certain important social welfare movements. Honest or not, it formed, for the included, a generally readable language of meaning and values around experience. This was a compact that held across an evolution of media, styles, and values for a good 100 years. But now the world and its representational systems have changed, and these new realisms are no longer adequate to our crises and our questions. Perhaps they never were. But in this world, in these times, realism is a dodge and a fraud. What do I mean by realism? Social media documentation of the lives of friends and strangers, news streams of current events, large and small, calamitous and banal, updated minute by minute as the feeds refresh. Fresh reels of someone dancing in their living room, again. Text messages updating us on the minutiae of the lives and activities of friends and family. Testimonies of lived experience as evidence of defined and declared identities. Endless assertions of the authenticity of self. This is what I mean by realism, and it is a discourse that subsumes individuals, communities, cultures, and nations and the politics that serve and control them. Not long ago, on a bus to the airport, I found myself sitting behind a man with his phone held up to the window to record the shifting, featureless, ex-urban landscape outside. He was shooting still photographs, hitting the shutter button as many times as possible across perhaps a minute. Later, maybe, he would select one of these hundreds of pictures to reflect the, quote, reality of what he wasn't really seeing. Or he would never look at them again. This, then, is realism. And then there is the mundane utilitarianism of most people's image making. Think, for a moment, of all the pictures on our phones. Pure reference is the generic order of the day. A product, an object, an injury, a purchase, a refund, a document, a defect. The list goes on and on. I recently tried to scroll through the entire nearly endless banal record of, quote, experience on my phone. My own reality was too boring even for me. Most of the rest of it is merely proof. Where you were, who you were with, how good or young or old or rich or happy or funny you were or are. What you like, what you value, what you see, who you want others to believe yourself to be. A perhaps aspirational form of relentless realism. One could call it lies, but that suggests too much deliberate subversion. None of this transgresses. All of it affirms and therefore circumscribes. We hem ourselves and others ever further in. This new realism does not offer meaning. It provides only description and representation, identification and definition. As such, it refuses to establish a shared moral, ethical, or emotional signification. It rejects the building of any new collective imagination. We need to know about the world and others, but in our social and cultural dialogues, we increasingly fall back on the real as it relates only to some ever-shrinking circle around ourselves. And then there is the news. Will one more image of loss or suffering, whoops. Am I good with time? Yeah. Okay. Will one more image of loss or suffering produce an ounce of change? We feel broken by it, but the world, its actors and instigators, continue on. In the relentlessly refreshing streams, there is a sensation of absorbing new knowledge, which instantly evaporates. We seek another hit, but to the same effect. In the end, there is only another weeping father holding his dead son, one more vast forest on fire, a rage-filled demagogue gesturing defiantly, a bombed hospital, a bombed school, flooded farmlands, dried up crops, striking workers, refugees in boats, migrants on foot, protests in Caracas, Tel Aviv, New York, Los Angeles, Hong Kong, Paris, Dhaka, and Tehran, dispersed with more state violence, a bomb shelter filled to bursting, school shooting survivors huddled together with flowers, an aerial view of unspeakable destruction with a lone figure on a broken bicycle wobbling through the wreckage. We live in an era of enormous and immensely complicated problems. The climate crisis and its already cascading impacts on humanity, the related crises of migration and poverty, the related crisis of democracy itself. I could go on and on. These are big questions that move between the intangibly abstract and the overwhelmingly present and entangled. Between these extremes of scale, in the face of overwhelming form and formlessness, perhaps realism is of no use at all, at least as we currently construct it. Realism is now a methodology designed for despair. Realism is a form that does not admit to failure or the invisible. It does not admit to secrets and the unknown, to mystical states of being. Realism does not acknowledge the fundamental action of desire, which is ever more important in a world ravaged by violence, abuse, and neglect. This realism, which is so far from rich experience, is an aesthetic that enriches the new gatekeepers of the everyday and the immense wealth and power they aggregate through our shattered attention. In realism, we have only the endless, tedious present. In realism, there is no future. And then, not to leave you in total despair, I will read one paragraph towards the end of the book that is part of this series of attempts to try and find a new way forward with images that is less solitary and creates more shared meaning in various ways. Realism exists to prevent us from closing our eyes. But if we can learn again to see with our eyes closed, we may then be able to learn to see in the dark. And we may then be able to find our way towards each other, arms outstretched in the encroaching night, to make arrangements in the dying light, finding where it still falls, amplifying what remains through refraction. We could connect ourselves through gestures, pointing us together. We could entangle our limbs, mingle our breaths, dissolve our discrete selves in collective construction. The real will not be readable. Dogmas might slip into shadow, but there, in the darkness, we will have one another. Twilight shapes attesting towards imaginable futures. And I wanted to end with that passage because I think it helps make a connection between what I'm talking about and what Matthew's images are doing, which for me are, like that book to me is one of the ways that I can see forward beyond the mere ceaselessness of description. So maybe we can go from there. Hello?
Hello.
Okay.
We got it.
So
No,
we had a few questions for each other.
yeah, but I was actually thinking we should maybe deviate from the script a little bit because
Sure.
and just like linger on your argument because 10 minutes is not nearly enough time to unpack just like how eloquent and nuanced, thoughtful it is. So I think something when I first read it, and I told you this, that I tripped up on the sort of distinctions you were making between contemporary realism, which I'm trying to coin differently. I think of it as Instagram realism or capitalist realism, which is that Mark Fisher term we talked about a little bit. Maybe I think he kind of looms in the background of both of these books a little bit. So, yeah, well, maybe the question I had was, I guess I kept on thinking when you were talking about contemporary realism, it was also an indictment of more historical forms of realism. And I think there is that. I think there is. I think there are moments in the book where you acknowledge, let's say, the more manipulative nature of like socialist realism or like a kind of tautological realism, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that realism still exists, and it's still such a dominant form. And I guess the worry I have, and I do sort of like wholeheartedly agree with the book, and sort of as it exists as a prompt, And I think it, like the spoiler alert, I don't think either of us are offering concrete solutions yet, but we're sort of using these books as a vehicle for thinking about these issues. So this is really long-winded, but this sort of fear started percolating in me that if we sort of walk away from those traditional forms of realism, they could be ceded to the right, like the right of the political spectrum, And however manipulative they are, they're still really quite powerful, and especially in a moment where authoritarian governments are really leaning into deep fakes. So I don't know if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think, in general, I think of this book more as a provocation and a prompt than like a clean, defensible argument. And like one of the things I'm doing is changing the definition of realism for the moment. So it is a rupture from what realism as a tradition does, and part of my point is that rupture. That is still an active tradition, but part of my thinking in the book is that we have such a flood of so many different visual traditions of representation of the real now that they all blur. And so we don't have any coherent framework for reading these images that come from all these different registers and that could be, historically would have been read in more discrete registers of meaning. So like even the aesthetic forms of what looks realistic have changed from a kind of like modernist formalism in photography to like the like streams of video footage that came from like the first Gulf War to like webcam footage to like a super produced Instagram photography. So like there's all these different aesthetic registers so that we can't make those distinctions anymore. And to me, the older tradition of realism as it evolved was closer to an allegorical tradition, which is what I'm kind of going back to explore, like a formal language that was designed to convey collective meaning that could be shared, which is often a form of coercion or control, but was also a form of creating shared values and communicating shared values. So my question is like, how can we look back to learn some of those techniques without reverting to authoritarian methods? And I think that's urgent because it seems like the only real political force that understands the power of allegory in the present is the right. And like at one moment in the book I say, like, Trump is understood as an allegory by those who follow him, and we understand him as like a bad man making bad decisions. And that's the wrong way to think about it. Like, we need other allegories to counter that allegorical language when that's really what drives emotionality, I guess. And maybe that's a way to kind of turn to your images. Because one thing I think your images turn away from is clear narrative and an immediate readability. Like, a lot of the images in Matthew's book function to me like hieroglyphs, like something that should be readable to me. It feels like it's readable as meaning, and yet I can't quite make it out. So there's like a lot of unanswered questions in image after image, blank spaces, things where I should be able to read or understand what's happening, but I can't. And which really draws me into the moment and the suspense of the images. And I was wondering if maybe you could talk about that a little bit. Like, what is the role of ambiguity or unreadability in these images that come from unfolding situations that are full of narrative and political potential?
I never thought of them in terms of hieroglyphs. Like, I don't, but maybe that's a good way to think about it, because I don't think they're inscrutable. Like, they just demand, well, I hope they do, you know, if they don't, they're not quite successful for me, but I hope they demand more attention, you know. So, you know, people that are, I guess, familiar with these contexts can read things into them that maybe a casual viewer or someone who doesn't spend enough time with the images wouldn't be able to do. So it's so it is a request for people to really linger on these things, you know. And I think, and I do think beauty is a part of that, you know. And I do think that you know, I don't like to think that I'm sort of aestheticizing destruction. Like, I do think that the beauty that I'm encountering is really true to what I'm seeing, and that's part of what makes all these situations and the images of them so unbearable. But I think that I maybe like hieroglyphs, glyphs. There's meaning that emerges in the relationships between these things. Like, there's a syntax, and so I do think that for me, a lot of the meaning comes later in the process of building the relationships between the images, you know. And I normally think of it maybe more in terms of motifs, like things that can create a sense of a pattern, which I think is a prerequisite for beauty. And those patterns create a sort of more complicated structure that like forces you to engage with it differently. And that can be the forms that are emerging. It can be color. It could be the repeated use of shapes that happens in the images. Yeah.
So that's when you say pattern as a prerequisite for beauty.
I think of this. I gotta remember it. I think of this Robert Adams quote that he says when he talks about beauty being necessary because it creates a sense of pattern, which allows us to cope with the fact that there's no meaning in the world, and that our suffering has no meaning. I think it's something like that. Yeah.
I mean, one thing about beauty, like if we think of it from a kind of like the Kantian perspective on beauty as like a place in which there can be an agreement that something is beautiful, as opposed to like the sublime, which is a unique experience that is internal to every individual. And if you think of moving like into 20th century art and representation, it moves more towards that singularity of experience and away progressively from the collectivity of experience. And I think it makes me think about like beauty as a tool for creating a common experience. And, well, go on. You look like you're about to say something.
No,
Oh.
go on.
And maybe that's related to what you're talking about in terms of building this vocabulary.
Yeah, but I think that's related to what you're talking about too, and I think that's where there is like a more forceful conversation between these books because, there's a way in which your book is really calling for these allegories of solidarity, right? Which is love, right? And I think that my understanding of allegory or why we're sort of like struggling with this now is because allegory sort of rests on a sort of shared cosmology, right? And that was something like modernism destroyed, right? For our, at least like Christian allegorical regimes. But it didn't replace it with anything, right? And so now, like, I think there's a way in which we are struggling and realizing the power of like mythology and these kind of shared stories and shared understandings of things.
Yeah, and I think the challenge is like, how do you create shared mythologies without creating repressive narratives?
Exactly. Yeah.
So that's what we have to keep working on. Yeah. Could I talk for a moment about the text in your book? Because it's easy to forget that there's a text in this book because there's so many like large, beautiful, strange images. But the Matthew's text is a very strange short story that is kind of allegorical, I would have to say, about people collecting petitions. I mean, I'm not going to do justice to the narrative of it, but it seems to be a text that is often about a despair of making change in the world or the possibility of making change in the world. And I'm curious, like, how there's more despair in that text than there is in the images.
Yeah, I think so. And I think that's something that I'm often like encountering. There's a sort of ways in which the work really, what I'm trying to do exists between the images and text, and I think like the photographs can't say exactly what I want all the time, so I need the text to do that, and the text couldn't do that on its own either, and maybe that's a pretty simplistic way of looking at it, but there's something in the sort of I think the necessity of persistence that feels like important to go through in that text, even if that sort of persistence like leads to absurdity, like an absurd routine of trying to puncture through and sort of allow us to see things differently, right? And so, and that's something that I sort of like, maybe was really influenced by the capitalist realism book, is this idea that that these tiny moments could like create a rupture. So like capitalist realism is like our inability to imagine anything beyond capitalism. Like it just creates this atmosphere for us, right? And so I think what Mark was arguing is that it's just become so like embedded in the way that we operate, and it's allowed us to participate in capitalism. At the same time, we sort of perform our anti-capitalism. So our anti-capitalist gestures have been completely co-opted by capitalism. Like he uses Wall-E and Children of Men as examples of this. And I forget where I was going with that, but he has so like what made me sort of bring him up, and I have it here somewhere, is this quote which he ends his book on, which I do also think is like a moment of hope that feels like really resonant between like the way that we're thinking. That when this book came out, sort of in the wake of the financial collapse in 2008, I was thinking about it a lot, and ultimately I think these thoughts led me to want to engage with the Occupy movement, because however the Occupy movement ended up, I still feel like that was such a worthwhile experiment in participatory democracy, and it really did shift the conversation so much, and we got this close to electing Bernie Sanders. But
Incredible.
yeah. You are having an incredible day. Do we have to go?
Sorry.
Do we have to go? A little bit? Yeah, okay.
We can see if there are a few questions, maybe.
Oh, wait, maybe just read this quote, because I feel like it's a nice thing to end on. Right?
Okay.
Okay. So this is like the last paragraph of Capitalist Realism, where Fisher says, the long, dark night of the end of history has to be grasped as an enormous opportunity. The very oppressive pervasiveness of capitalist realism means that even glimmers of alternative political and economic possibilities can have a disproportionately great effect. The tiniest event can tear a hole in the gray curtain of reaction, which has marked the horizons of possibility under capitalist realism. From a situation in which nothing can happen, suddenly anything is possible again. And I feel like that tiny moment is a thing that I'm always like trying to put myself in proximity to.
All right.
Sorry, that was a little melodramatic, but so yeah, questions for Nick, please.
Hello.
Or not.
Congratulations, both of you.
Thanks.
Matthew.
I can't
quick-
see anyone. Oh, okay.
It's Colin.
Yeah.
Sorry. The vertical nature of making. How'd you kind of land on that way of describing what you're seeing?
What do you mean by
The vertical nature of the photographs, which feels like a very specific decision for a while now with what you make.
I don't know. It's just the way I see things now. It's sort of, I guess it was a little weird, but it's, I think that pivot happened a long time ago when I stopped thinking like the primary way I wanted my images to exist was on a wall. You know, I was sort of like trained in an art school, and I was putting pictures on walls, and those were all horizontal. But when I sort of re-shifted towards seeing the book as maybe the most important manifestation of my work, it's kind of solved a problem for me. It's just like not going across the gutter. I mean, that's a simple thing, but I don't know. It's just become sort of ingrained in the way that I think about and see pictures. So I don't have a really good answer for that other than that. Yeah.
Thank you all so much for this. I wonder about the location of the allegory or of the allegorical. Like, is the invitation to produce an image that announces itself as allegory, or is the invitation to read images that present themselves as the real allegorically? And here you like invited us to think with Marx initially. Like that idea that, you know, he spent very few pages describing communism, but he spent thousands upon thousands of pages describing capitalism that presents itself as real, but he shows how that presentation of like the immediately real capitalism is actually mediated in ways that it effaces as it presents itself as the immediate. So is the invitation to say, you know, not, hey, here are more allegorical images, or here's an image that does allegorical work, but is it to instead read that which presents itself as real, Trump, allegorically, to show the bundles of relationships that are effacing themselves and presenting themselves as the immediate or the real?
Yeah, I think, I mean, the short answer would be yes, like both. To me, the more important question, I guess, is like one of the things I talk about in the book later when I get into more like arguing for what we can learn from allegorical traditions has to do with an act of images that come from and produce a kind of faith that is beyond the mereness of representation. And that's where this idea of allegory to me connects with love. Like when you have an object of love, it's an object in which you invest a kind of faith that is not just a realist faith. It's aspirational and it's connective. And so whether those are images that come from the real or come purely from the imagined, the idea that you're creating images motivated by and motivating a kind of faith that is beyond what can be seen. So there's that kind of like it's images that resist being reduced to what it can be seen and known, and that encourage a kind of belief in possibility, I guess. So that's my answer.
That was a good answer. I can't do better than that.
Do we have time for one more question, and then we can just wrap up? Okay.
Okay. Thank you for coming.
we
We are actually going to be. Unfortunately, we can't sign books right now, but there is
We can sign books apparently
Oh, we
for
can.
like the next 10 minutes at the
Okay.
MACK table downstairs, which
and
is just right down the bottom of the stairs.
and I'm also going to be signing books in about an hour in Chinatown at a gallery called Seasons. And if you just want to come by and talk more and have a drink, it's like right above where Leroy's is, and I think there's a party there later tonight. So that's running from
And there's drinks.
yeah.
There's drinks.
Yeah, there's a little card here with the address. If anyone wants to grab one, feel free to come by. Okay.
Thank
All
you.
right, thank you.